Hello and welcome. This is a recording prepared for the Lower Columbia Canoe Club. I gave this presentation Saturday night. A number of people missed it and asked me to provide a recording, so here we go. First of all, thank you to the Lower Columbia Canoe Club. This trip came together after Ron LaGraff and I met at the Sweetheart Paddle in 2023, the Valentine's Day paddle, and is somewhat of a reprise of a presentation that I gave 20 years ago at the request of Mark Scandalbury, then the club president. So the LCCC has been part of the club for a long time. Eric Lee joined our group, and Eric and I had met before. He had guided canoe trips at the Somers Canoe Base, the Northern Tier High Adventure Base, where I had guided many, many years ago. And while we were of different generations, we had some of the same background and interests in paddling. So I was pleased to have Eric joining the trip as well. We started out with months of preparation, checking out gear, figuring out how to set up our pack boats, re-rigging our tarps, all those kinds of things. Packed up all of our gear with a little help from our canine companions and shipped all of our stuff actually over a month ahead of time. So this follows the presentation that I gave in Toronto a few weeks ago at the Wilderness and Canoe Symposium. And I'll just kind of run through some slides here to give you a sense for it. But one of the questions that's often asked is why canoe the Dubawnt, especially twice. It's actually because it's such a remote river that's rich in history. And rather than saying just because it's there, I'll say, because it's a beautiful river in a very remote place. This is the barren grounds. And you can see that the river starts and runs, over 600 miles. And Joseph Campbell, the comparative ethnologist and person responsible for coining the term the monomyth, separation, initiation, and return, that's followed in all mythology, said, follow your bliss. If you do what you love and you go where your heart takes you, you will find perfect happiness. It's a state of spiritual joy. And so the other thing that I would say that he needed to add to that conversation was follow your blisters, because doing something like this is at times quite challenging. So here we go down the Dubawnt. We started at Stony Rapids, Saskatchewan, just south of the border of the Northwest Territories, not far from where Manitoba and Saskatchewan come together, and we paddled a little over 600 miles to Baker Lake. We actually started our trip here at Wholdaia Lake. We flew in the first 130 miles or so, so we didn't have to do the overland portion, although one of our party, Eva Kinflova, managed to paddle in with another guy named Zach, and then we met her after her first 2 weeks of the trip. So why paddle the Dubawnt? Well, when John Sperry gave me a call and we talked about paddling the Dubawnt a few years ago, I said I wasn't really that interested because I had paddled it before. But then I looked at my photos and I remembered having such a great experience on my 2003 trip. There's a half a dozen lakes that you get to before Dubawnt Lake, another half a dozen lakes that you paddle after Dubawnt Lake. And I thought, wow, I should go repeat this trip again. It is a spectacular trip. It's an area that is just loaded with wildlife. I remembered fondly seeing the muskox, the grizzly bears, caribou, and moose. And I remembered having a wolf in camp, having close encounters with bear cubs, and um, fantastic paddling on a variety of water, both big rivers, big lakes, still waters, and quiet times. And overall, I remember having a great crew in 2003 with some of my paddling partners. It took me almost 10 years to get ready to do the Dubawnt. I had paddled other trips since the early 90s, but I needed to have lots of time off. It's a 45-day trip. And in 2003, I paddled that trip with Jim Gallagher and Steve Kolop, who had been on prior trips with me, including the Back River. And I probably had more than a half a dozen long Arctic trips under my belt before I paddled the Dubawnt. But it was definitely a river worth repeating. And you can see here the primary feature of the Dubawnt river system is Dubawnt Lake, which is the size of Rhode Island. It's 70 miles north-south, 50 miles east-west. It's a feature which has its own its own weather system at times. It's often frozen 10 months out of the year. So it's a spectacular feature to work your way around. This river was first explored by the Tyrrell brothers, Joseph and James. James wrote a book about it in 1908. Joseph and James actually mapped the river for the Geological Survey. And it's in the heart of what we call the barren grounds. And the barren grounds is this area that's kind of north of tree line, west of Hudson Bay, and it actually extends further almost to the Arctic coast. But I defined kind of the limit here by the Back River, which was previously explored by George Back, previously known as the Great Fish River. Chesterfield Inlet was known, that had been explored, and only Samuel Hearne had transected this region in 1770 when he led a trip, or was really led by a group of indigenous people on his route to the copper mine. And other than that, there is no historical record of people going into this area, although the indigenous people, the Chippewas from the south and the Inuits from the north, had hunted in this area for a long time, for generations. But I trace this back to J.B. Tyrrell as being kind of the one who inspired many journeys and inspired generations of paddlers to paddle this river. But who or what inspired Tyrrell to go on this trip? And that story goes back to 1892 when he was mapping in the area of the lake areas around Lake Athabasca. And in Lake Athabasca, he had met some Indians, and and Andrew was his guide, and Ithingo Campbell, and they provided sketch maps to the Dubawnt, the river that has a perimeter of water around the edges, is what it was known as. And it was an area that intrigued him as he saw these large canoes with parties of men going off into the barren lands to hunt. And so he inquired of them where were they going, and he had the good fortune to obtain from this man named Andrew a map of a good canoe route north from there, where the Indians travel in the barren grounds. And they said it was a trip that took 20 days to get there and to return, and from there it flows into a great river that flows into the sea. And he had never been there, but he had heard about it, and he was aware of it from his people. So with those sketch maps, he then spoke with Joe McCready, who was age 69, the trader at the Fond du Lac Hudson Bay post, towards the middle of the summer in 1892 while he was mapping and working in that area. And McCready also said that there's this great river that flows down to the sea on which muskox are plentiful, and the Eskimos are the only ones who go there. And so he was intrigued, and he convinced his boss to support a trip the following winter. So Tyrrell relied on the Chippewan hunting parties, some Indian hand-drawn maps. He had reviewed Samuel Hearne's journals where he had described Dubawnt Lake. He knew of George Back's journal, another Hudson Bay man named King, and he knew only that the Eskimos lived there and that nobody traveled in that area. So over the years, I continued to research the history of the Tyrrell brothers. That was really my primary motivation when I went in 2003, was to kind of retrace some of the routes that Tyrrells had taken. So without a lot of ado, the Tyrrell brothers got their expedition approved. Joe hired his brother James as the Inuit interpreter, and he hired 3 excellent canoemen who were able to navigate the waters that they were encountered. So he had Michel, Louis, and Pierre French, who were Iroquois from the area near Montreal. They only spoke French. So a lot of their communication was by pantomime, since the Tyrrell brothers did not speak French. They also hired 3 Métis men as packers, John Flett, James Corrigal, and Francois Maurice. And that consisted of the crew. They had tried to hire a Chippewan guide, a guy named Moberly, and he either quit or was fired. There's certainly no love lost between them. but negotiations broke down, and Tyrrell eventually said, well, heck, we'll just do this without a guide. And it was it worked out just fine with the 3 canoes with the 8 men. So um, the second major recreational or major trip that I'm going to talk about in this presentation is the Moffatt canoe trip in 1955. This was what I would say is the pioneering recreational canoe trip in the Barren Lands. Nobody had done this before purely for recreational means without the assistance of native canoemen and guides and packers. Others, gentlemen adventurers dating back to David Hanbury or James Critchell Bullock or Bob Monroe Ferguson, had accompanied other journeys and had employed various Indians or others to, indigenous people to go with them on these trips. But Moffatt recruited 5 college students, 1 from Harvard, 3 from Dartmouth, and 1 who had just gotten out of the Army. And with this crew of 5 young men and himself as the 36-year-old leader of the trip, he put together an expedition to cross the Barren Grounds by canoe. He planned to film a documentary of this trip, and that was his primary motivation for going. He did extensive research, and he even communicated with Joseph Tyrrell, who advised him to bring a gun, a high-powered rifle, so that he could hunt along the way, and advised that there was no fuel in the area, there was no food to be eaten, and they probably couldn't carry enough for an expedition of that length. So this was really a pioneering canoe trip in the 1950s. Others that were paddling for recreational means really paddled much further south, where Moffatt had started on the Albany River, going into James Bay, where he'd led a half a dozen trips and made a previous film. So when I first did the trip in 2003, I was aware of the Moffatt expedition as kind of the so-called ill-fated recreational canoe trip that was described in Eric Morse's book and in newspaper articles. Many people quoted the Sports Illustrated article that talked about some of the hardships that they endured and somewhat dramatized what happened when Moffatt died on that canoe trip after a tragic accident on September 14th, which was very, very late in the season. That was made more clear by George Grinnell's book, which came out right around the time I had gone on this first trip in 2003. It was just a few years before, A Death on the Barrens, which had been published and details a lot of the drama that took place on the trip and is a very kind of poetic account, although it has some things that are not clearly defined as, I would say, as in facts. There's a little bit of literary license in that book that is not supported by the journals that we read, but it's George Grinnell's story about what had happened to him some 40 years earlier. And it's a very dramatic story and talks about some of the hardships that they endured, including, braving fires and, difficult portages, difficult bugs, running out of food, having kind of infighting amongst themselves about the food that they had. And it ultimately resulted in the death of their leader, and the crew managed to pull together and kind of have this harrowing race for the final portion of the trip to get to the safety of a community at Baker Lake before winter came. So in the years that passed since I had first paddled this trip in 2003, a second book was published and additional articles came out, including a book written by another of the survivors of that 1955 trip, Fred Skip Pessel. And there was an entire issue of Nastagon dedicated to that trip. And my friend Alan Jacobs and I exchanged a number of notes throughout the kind of mid 2010s regarding his theories of what had happened and his defense of Art Moffatt, who is kind of slayed by the media and the press, and people said that he was a terrible leader and that he had no business being up there and things like that. I think it's a lot more complicated than that, and I'll try to show you in this presentation how that played out and what I learned and what I observed on my trip relative to the trip that I'd taken 20 years earlier. So Eric Morse had said that Moffatt, leading a group of young Americans, let the days slip away too easily on the Dubawnt River in 1955 later forcing the party into risks that proved fatal. And I think that is somewhat true. I think that they were taken aback by the suddenness of winter when it finally came in, and that forced them to move very quickly. Until that time, I believe that they were somewhat unaware of the hazards of winter, and they were working hard. They were carrying very heavy loads. Moffatt's trip really stands out as the longest of canoe trips that I have come to find on the Dubawnt, and the slowest moving. Up until the time of their accident, they moved an average of 7 miles a day, 7.7 miles a day, whereas after the accident, they moved it over 20. They were the latest in the season to reach Baker Lake. And over the years, I've collected a number of trip journals and reviewed other trip journals and looked at their average miles. And at each major segment along the river, the Moffatt party was the latest to get there, stayed there and lingered the longest, partly because they were hunting to supplement their diet, and partly because they were filming and they were tired after carrying heavy loads, so they declared various holidays. So I had a number of questions this year when I paddled the Dubawnt, and they're kind of listed there. You can read those, but I really went with a great deal of curiosity and questioning things that I had perhaps taken as fact on my first trip in 2003 about the Moffatt trip. And about 2 weeks before I left, I got a note from Alex Gusev at the Wilderness Canoe Association indicating that this man, Matthew Boyd, was creating a movie, that he had come in contact with Fred Pessel through his son and Pessel's grandson, and that he had located the original 16 millimeter film, which is an interesting story, and that he was creating a new documentary. And I looked him up on the internet, seemed like an accomplished guy, later got to know him and talked with him. But 2 weeks before the trip, I said, hey, I'm going back to the Dubawnt. I paddled this river before. I'm going to be in Baker Lake. If you want to go to Baker Lake and do some filming, that would be a great time to do that. And I will be there in mid-August. And so he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to do that or not. But I changed my inReach plan, my satellite communicator, to an unlimited plan from the one a day plan. And we kept in touch as I started down the trip just a few weeks later. So here's our crew. I met John and Mason sitting. John's in the back there with holding the beer, and Mason with to his left, and then Ron is in the front, and Eric on the right. So Eric and Ron are from Portland. John's in Salt Lake City. Mason is in Bozeman, Montana, and we finally met in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan on July 2nd. We were planning to leave the next morning to fly out to Saskatoon. Mason's luggage didn't arrive, unfortunately, so there's a little bit of a delay there. But this is our 2023 crew. Again, 6 people. The one that I knew the best was Eva. She and I had paddled together on 2 other trips, one across Ungava and one across the subarctics of Canada, which included traversing Carey Lake and the Dubawnt River in 2012. So all these crews have to get to Lake Athabasca and Stony Rapids. And Athabasca Lake is quite a long lake. It is just south of the Northwest Territories border, or now the Nunavut border, at 59 degrees. The way that the Tyrrell party got in was by train that they had taken that eventually led them to Edmonton, and then they had some by carts and wagons, and then worked their way down the Athabasca River by canoe, up and over the height of land, down to Baker Lake, on to Chesterfield, then down the west coast of Hudson Bay to Churchill in late October. And then they had to wait for freeze up. They worked their way down to York Factory, and they got back down to Winnipeg by January 1st the following year in 1894. The Moffatt party also started by train, and they started in New Hampshire and worked their way to Montreal by train, then to Toronto, to Ottawa, to Winnipeg, and on to Calgary, to Prince Albert, and then they flew in a DC-3 where they landed on a gravel strip to begin their canoe trip from Stony Rapids. So our logistics were also somewhat complex. Eva lives in Toronto, and she had to get to Winnipeg, where she had a friend who drove her from Winnipeg to Regina to pick up this guy named Zach, who was going to go on a canoe trip with her for leaving 2 weeks earlier with one of my canoes. And that's her friend Jacques, who drove her to Stony Rapids. The rest of us had to ship all of our gear. So 3 of us from Portland and John from Salt Lake shipped all of our gear to Bozeman, Montana, where Mason drove it to Regina in his truck, where Jacques picked it up with Eva and drove it all the way up here to Stony Rapids. And so we had to ship all of our gear on June 1st so that we could pick it up on July 2nd. And the reason we had to do that is because air travel is very, very expensive. This is the plane that we flew in, and that's our gear. We were limited to 50 pounds per person, and anything above that would cost $2.50 a pound, which was just would be cost prohibitive with all the amount of gear that we had to carry for our crew for last summer. So we finally assembled at Stony Rapids, a community of about 500, still primarily a Chippewayan community on kind of the edge of Lake Athabasca. It was kind of a smoky summer, but you could see all the planes there waiting for us when we arrived, and we were planning to leave that same day, but since we were missing one of our party, we ended up staying 2 nights in Stony Rapids waiting for him. This is the Moffatt crew. They also had problems getting their gear, and were waiting for 2 weeks in Stony Rapids back in 1955. They ended up purchasing a lot of their food from the Hudson Bay Company store there and supplementing their provisions. And you can see that they were carrying, a Coleman stove and heavy boxes, crates, as well as their packs, completely stuffed to the brim, and their canoes were riding fairly low in the water once they did get started. They had hired a Model T truck to take them over the trail to Black Lake, where they actually began their trip. And while we were there, we had to wait for a few days at the wonderful facilities of Wings Over Kississing at the floatplane base in Stony Rapids, where we were able to enjoy the facilities. We cooked our meals and waited. We got a chance to check out the town. You could buy a red onion for $5.40. Quite expensive. When the Moffatt party was there, they had to buy 87 onions. They had to buy a 90-pound bag of oatmeal, and they bought glass jars of peanut butter to go on their trip. So this is a town where things are quite expensive. Everything is either trucked in or flown in, and getting things. The road's only been there for maybe 10 or 15 years now, so it's a very expensive, very remote northern community where the cost of living is very high. So a couple days later, Mason arrived with all of his gear in Stony Rapids. They pulled out the full welcome for him, and we went to get him when the plane arrived, and then we had to wait for our plane to arrive. The float planes were all busy that day, so we weren't able to leave until the next morning. But here we are with all of our gear ready to go, and you can see the Moffatt's gear is all ready to go at the beginning of their trip. There's George Grinnell adjusting the tump line for his gear in 1955. And we started off on our way. It was kind of interesting. You can read the 2 quotes and the 2 perspectives there about what it was like in 1893 versus 2023. I was reading the other day some of the correspondence between James Tyrrell and his brother Joe, who had hired him as an Eskimo interpreter and also to help make the maps of the area. James had written back to his brother that he was happy to do the work and to join as an interpreter, and advising his brother to be sure to provide good maps of the area, since those would be very important, not realizing at the time that he was the one that was actually supposed to be drawing the maps. And so this is a copy of his map that he drew going over the Haida Land portage, and where they raised a flag and surveyed the area for the Geological Survey of Canada. Luckily, we were able to short circuit that by flying into Wholdaia Lake. And Eva and her friend Zach had paddled in one of my canoes from Black Lake to Wholdaia. It took them about 2 weeks to get there. It takes most groups about two weeks to get there. We were able to fly there in an hour. And the Moffatt party by this time had already spent 23 days getting there. They had very, very heavy packs, lots of things to carry, multiple trips on a portage, and they were portaging through forest fires. So they started out already kind of a week in the hole relative to what is now kind of, I would say, conventional wisdom about how long it takes to travel in this area. But keep in mind that they weren't in a hurry. They were also filming a documentary, and it takes a lot of time to set up all these shots. And so they were really committed to their track, and they really said that they had all summer to do this. They weren't worried about the schedule. So here we are unloading, and very quickly, the plane is empty and it's silent, and we're figuring out which way to go. The river flows out to the north, and we got oriented and we started on our way. And here's our crew together for the first time after having only Zoom meetings and email correspondence with each other. I paddled with Eric. John and Mason paddled together as they had on a previous trip that they'd been on, and Eric, Eva, and Ron paddled together. So the river begins with a series of small lakes and interconnected with little stretches of river. And some of these lakes are quite difficult to navigate. They're filled with lots of different bends. It's not always clear where the current goes or if there is any current. But we're heading down north. Our first night we got stuck in some windy weather, and this is the first place where you test the crew's dynamics, because camping really is terrible on Wooldaya Lake. It's very much filled with these black spruce trees that go down to the shore. Not a lot of open areas, kind of challenging to find a place to camp. So we tucked out of the wind, discussed where to go, and then started exploring places to camp, which involves trying to find a landing, crashing through the brush, going up to find a place to camp, and then waving the canoes on to the next place where you'd repeat the cycle again until you could figure out where you can set up your tents. The camping gets progressively better as you go further north, and we did find a place to camp, what I would call a very aesthetic campsite, almost park-like, and most of our campsites were quite nice. So you can see us stretched out there and ready to go. Um, and in comparison, just back to 1955, you can see the Moffatt party had Army surplus tents with what I call the sphincter exits, the little doors that go by drawstring, and they're already held together with found lumber poles that they were using as tent poles, and they had to put a tarp over it to keep them from leaking. As their trip progressed, they did get to the point where they actually had a tent destroyed, and they had to clamber three people into one of those two-man tents. So they were using the gear that was available at the time. These were fairly standard tents. Things have evolved since then, so we had tents that are much more capable of handling bigger storms, and much lighter weight, larger, better mosquito netting, etc. So here we are, and another thing of note is that the way that people pack for foods has really changed over the years. Back in the day when Moffatt traveled, it was not uncommon to have a 50-pound bag of flour and a 90-pound bag of oatmeal and a 30-pound bag of sugar. What we did though is we had all of our meals prepackaged and dehydrated, and we didn't carry any canned goods. The Moffatt party had cans of bully beef, which was kind of a predecessor to Spam. And we were not in, we had kind of, our meals were pretty easy to prepare. It involved boiling water, and things are kind of pre-portioned out. We also brought with us the traditional Voyageurs drink of lemonade and rum, Voyageurs Punch, which was a good prevention for the possibility of snake bite. And so another of the differences between the troops. We also had lots of fish along the way. Eva was one of our expert fisher people, and she loved to bake the fish over an open fire. And you can see that. We had plenty of time in the evenings. On this trip, we planned about 13 miles a day, so we really had plenty of time to enjoy our evenings. We camped early. We found places to camp. This is another one of our early campsites that's a little bit in the brush where the bugs are a little bit worse, but on this day they weren't too bad. And We took turns cooking, so every sixth day, one of us would be responsible for cooking, and the next day we'd be responsible for doing the dishes. Each day, Mason liked to get up and deliver the wake-up call.
Lee, Eric, Lee, Eric,
So
five
this was
o'clock.
our morning call,
Pretty calm out here.
and I was just amazed that somebody likes to get up at that time of the day. I would have slept till 8 if I could, but it's really important to get out and start making your miles before the wind comes up. So we did that. Almost immediately, we started running into things that were noted by both Tyrrell and Moffatt, and this was the peak glaciers that they found in one of the first rapids that we came to.
We are nearing the north end of Wholdaia Lake, and this is the first moving water that we've seen. A beautiful day, July 7th.
So we also found places where we found teepees or poles from teepees, and tucked away our campsites in little coves and places where there's evidence of people who had camped before us, like the Moffatt party had. Here's one of our
This
typical
is near the
rapids. Ron
beginning
is
of the
narrating.
trip. We're still figuring things out. One of the first rapids that we encountered. The lead boat, they often used backfearing as a method. And that would have been good to know because we came through and we used running high braces. We worked over to eddies. We had a nice clean line all the way through and felt pretty comfortable. As the lead boat eddied out, we continued on, worked our way through the rapid, and met everybody down at the bottom.
So we're continuing our way north, heading up towards Hindi Lake, and you can see evidence of fires that had been in that area. This country is starting to get thin. There's a lot more eskers, and eskers provided great places to camp. Oftentimes we would hike the eskers in the evenings. We'd find evidence of animals that would run along the eskers. Also, a number of trappers' cabins, and Ray Moore was one of the men who had a series of cabins in that area. These were all visible to me in the 2003 trip, and there was evidence that they were in use when people like Bob O'Hara went on the trip in the 1970s. So it was always fun to go poke around and see these tilts, as they call them. And it looks like some of them have been in use more recently. So here we are, typical morning. Canoes are loaded up. We check in with each other, look at the maps, make sure we're all clear about where we're going for the day. We typically stayed together with the canoes, but you can get pretty strung out just paddling. So you always keep the canoe behind you in sight, and make sure that we check our maps frequently so we don't get lost. It's a maze of rivers and so on. Here's more rapids, kind of beginning to have some moving water, and that's also relief. Plus some great sand hills that you can see, where every time you get out, you walk up 50 feet, 100 feet, you find a great place to camp. And these are some of the beautiful campsites and lunch spots that we found where we were able to kind of explore and walk around. There's a beautiful long esker there. That esker on Boyd Lake runs more than 7 miles long, and actually it picks up and goes another 7 miles. So these are cross dissecting lots of regions. And this little bay here is quite interesting, this little pocket bay. And what I found interesting about that was, here's a picture. You can see our tents in 2023, and the same shot 20 years earlier when I was there at the very same spot in 2003. And here's the same shot from this angle last summer, 2023, and the same shot from Fred Gaskin's party in 1974 and from the Moffatt party in 1955. And I didn't plan to stay at this place, but numerous times on the trip, we ended up staying at the same campsites where others had stayed and where I had stayed before on my prior trip. So here we are a little further north at the end of Boyd Lake, and we had found a can of bear spray. And one of the things that I love about going on trips with other people is that different people have different talents and interests and backgrounds. Mason had been a biologist for the Department of Interior, and had extensive experience with big game, predators, bears specifically, and mountain lions and other big scary things. And so he gave us an in-service training of how to shoot the bear spray, how to aim it properly, and we all took turns practicing using his shotgun in the event of encounters with grizzly bears, which is generally pretty unlikely, but better prepared than not. And so that was a good in-service training that we had. At the north end of Boyd Lake, we camped again at a place where I had been in 2003, the same exact place, much to my surprise. And that was kind of a fun little thing, and that same rock. And here we are loading the canoes each morning. Kind of one of our morning rituals is making sure that we, load and balance the canoes
Oh my
properly.
God, what is Lee packing here? Ooh, maybe we have all the overproof rum. I better take it slowly. No injuries are allowed.
So working our way north, here's Eric.
We haven't seen a soul in weeks, not a plane in the sky. We have the river all to ourselves, just us and the wildlife. It's easy to get lost in thought. You wonder things like, did it look like this when the First Nations hunting parties were plying through these waters? When the Inuit were hunting for caribou? When the Tyrrell brothers were mapping the river? What was it like for Arthur Moffatt and his crew to paddle these waters?
And here we are taking a little lunch break, um, enjoying some of the plants and eating those. And here's last year's cranberries. They're best after they've been under the snow. And I'm going to pause right here at these artifacts. So here we are, the scourge of the north, these black flies. And our refuge from the black flies was either getting into our bug jackets or into the tent or into the Dubawnt diner, our screen to get out of the bugs. But where the bugs were feeding, so were the fish. And where the fish were feeding, so were the fishermen. And here's Ron with the largest lake trout that he's caught. Quite a nice fish. And so we ate a lot of fish on this trip. We're not the only ones to catch fish. Here's the Tyrrell brothers, some of their crew with a good catch of fish from 1893. And we would typically catch the fish during the day when we'd stop for a lunch or we just cast the line. We decided we needed fish for dinner. We'd fillet it there and put it in a Ziploc bag in the bottom of the canoe and cook it when we got to camp, so we didn't have the fish guts around where we were camping. But we had fish probably at least a third of the nights, over 25, maybe almost half of the nights we had fish fries or fish chowder or something like that. Arctic grayling on the right with Eva. And here's John cooking one of his famous fish fries, which was served with some rice pilaf. But cooking was a chore, but we took turns doing it, and we all loved to eat the fish, and we ate as much as we could. Here we are at Carey Lake, and Carey Lake is a place where in 1893 the Tyrrell brothers had encountered caribou, and in honor of the caribou that they had encountered, they erected a cairn and they flew the Union Jack. This summer we only saw 2 caribou. That's one of them right there at the bottom. 1893 they actually shot 30 caribou, and in my 2003 trip we saw big herds like this one there on the bottom. I've had other trips in this area. This is my 2012 trip. You can see the caribou just about as far as the eye will go. They were crossing a little bay where we were. I had my kite aerial photography rig up, and they were all over the place. So the caribou have pretty much disappeared from this area. They occasionally will appear, but the numbers have dwindled since the days of the hundreds of thousands of herds. And one of the mysteries that they're trying to figure out is where the caribou have gone. But the Tyrrell party relied on caribou. They were at the point where they were worried that they were going to have to turn back in 1893 because they weren't sure they were going to have enough to eat. The same thing happened to the Moffatt party in 1955 when they started to shoot caribou around this area, and they were drying their meat. So you can see here the Moffatt party wearing their blue jeans and their ponchos and their LL Bean boots, and then the Tyrrell party drying the 30 caribou that they shot. The Moffatt party shot a caribou about every 5 days or so, and that's about how long it lasted for them with the 6 men. And here they are, kind of another typical campsite for the Moffatt party. Under the rainbow, you can see their aluminum pail, their wooden boxes, the things that they're carrying, and the drying of the meat on the rack behind them. And stands in a pretty sharp contrast to the modern quick drying materials that we had. And here's our crew, similarly with a rainbow on a spot that looks not unlike the Moffatt party. I would say that the Moffatt party looks more like the Tyrrell party when you look at them. And this quote is something that I heard from Michael Peake, something that he has often said about his group, the Hideaway Canoe Club, and was written by a man who did a lot of mountain climbing in the Cascades. He said, "We were not pioneers ourselves, but we journeyed over old trails that were new to us, and with hearts open. Who shall distinguish?" And I think that pretty much sums up the character of our group, traveling in this area with our hearts open, trying to learn as much as we can about those who have come before and coming to appreciate the beauty of the landscape that the tundra provides. So amongst those who were pioneers, aside from the indigenous people, were the Tyrrell party. And in 1893, I mentioned they had flown the Union Jack and taken these famous pictures. And when we got to the same place, this erratic that I'd been to many times, I had planned to put the Union Jack, to restore the Union Jack and to leave it behind. But when we got there, it turns out that the cairn had disappeared. Somebody had taken it, and it was no longer there. So that was a big disappointment to me. In 2003, when we were there, we had left a note, and others over the years had left notes. And one of the most interesting notes was the one that was left behind by in 1969 by a party that said they had spent the summer east of Barlow Lake, just near there. And they said, "We will not be back. Rocks are interesting, but nothing of economic interest." And that kind of is surprising because in that area, there's diamond mines to the north, uranium mine to the northeast, gold mines to the north. There's quite a bit of economic interest. And when Samuel Hearn went in 1770 to the area of Dubawnt Lake, he said, "There's nothing but rocks here." When the Tyrrell brothers went in 1893, they said rocks are what they were looking for, and they kept close tabs of what the rocks were that they found. But it wasn't found to be economically viable until much, much later. So in 2003, we left a note. I was back in 2012, and we left another note. Here's some of the times that I've been there. This is a picture of Bob O'Hara and his crew in 1975. Here's my crew in 2003 with Jim Gallagher. Here's Jim Gallagher with us in 2012, Brian Johnston in 2012, and this is our trip last summer. So kind of famous to go up on top of the hill where the big peninsula is with Carey Lake in the background and leave our cairn notes. When we were there in 2012, Jim and I noticed that the notes had deteriorated significantly. This is the 1969 note, and then you can see the ink is fading. It had watermarks on it. It was starting to get torn. The same thing happened with the notes from 1974 that Fred Gaskin and Jack Purchase had left. So in 2012, we left a note saying that we noticed the notes have deteriorated, and we decided to take them with us and photograph them and return them the following summer with a group that we knew was going. And we did that, and it was published in a book called On Top of a Boulder. We were able to return the notes in a very expensive $200 Pelican box with a waterproof copy of the book. All the originals were returned, as well as a copy of the notes that were in this book that Brian Johnston published. And that's available now. You can buy it from Brian. It's not terribly expensive, and it's a real interesting point of view of the history of those who've left notes in the boulder, on top of the boulder, since the Tyrrell days. It's worth noting also that when the Moffatt party got to this place in August of 1955, they had hoped to see Tyrrell's notes that had been left behind. But when they got there, all they found was a modern pickle bottle inside the cairn with, and they left their own note. The other note that was in there was from a surveying party from the Geological Survey who had flown into that point. So I guess there's a history of leaving notes at cairns, and there's a note and a history of people taking them. So here's Eva. Eva is one of the unusual people that she's paddled the entire Dubawnt River now 3 times, and she also traversed it with me once in 2012. So this is her 4th time at the spot where she had left her notes. She was there in 2017, and the notes were still there, and she had read them. So the notes were there for a number of years, and sometime after 2017, and between then and our trip last summer, the notes had disappeared. So we also want to recognize Eva for being on our trip, one of the few women that's paddled this river so many times and a great adventurer. We had a little bit of trouble pronouncing her name. It's spelled I-V-A, and along the way, each of the 5 of us called her different things. And so one of the things that I'll say is I don't think we were a first or a pioneer in paddling the Dubawnt. We didn't go out to set any records or anything. But I'm pretty sure that Eric and I stand amongst the first to ever compose, choreograph, and perform a musical piece along the Dubawnt River. And here we are singing a song about Eva of the North.
Eva, of the North.
So that might not ever be sung again, but it was a first for us, and we were quite proud of it at the time. So here we are, Hilleberg Village, Carey Lake, our campsite with lots of bright Hilleberg tents that stand up quite well to the winds and the bugs. And we wear bright colors so that we're not going to get lost on the tundra. We can find our way very easily. Every night we would hike, great hiking. In the waning days, daylight, where the sun is out almost 24 hours a day. You see, wearing our bear spray and working our way north from Carey Lake. Campsites were often, I'd say more than a third of the time, we're just kind of out in the open air. There's no bugs, just quite a pleasant evening to sit there. Other times we would put up the Dubawnt Diner. Here we are celebrating Mason's birthday inside the Dubawnt Diner, where there's always a view. And the bugs just go to the top where they don't bother you. And so we really had increasingly beautiful campsites, and we're really appreciative of having our screen house to keep out of the bugs. During this portion of the trip, north of Carey Lake, as we went to Markham and Nicholson Lakes, we had lots of smoke from distant fires. We didn't actually see the fires, but there were days when it felt like we were paddling at night rather than the daytime because the smoke was so thick. It was definitely not healthy for people with compromised immune systems or anybody really to be out there in this level of smoke. But it was kind of eerie to be paddling in it. And we were lucky we didn't see any fires, but it was really, really thick and awful. And it was hot at times. So, we're also wearing shirt sleeves at times, as the sun warmed up a little bit. We could stop and sleep just about anywhere and get a good nap in. We also had days when we were able to sail and really smooth sailing. So here we are sailing with the wind paddle sails. You could really just kick back and enjoy the ride for a while there. So here we are, we finally reached Dubawnt Lake. When I was there in 2003, we'd encountered lots of grizzly bears. A mama with 2 cubs that she was suckling. And we worked our way around the west and north shores, and you can kind of see our route there and the different places that we had camped. But this is an area where the Dubawnt Lake sometimes has its own weather system and can be kind of challenging to cover. So here we are working our way north. You can see in 1893, the Tyrrell party had encountered big ice flows. Here they are taking a measurement for latitude. And here's the 1955 trip. They're there very late in the year, August 30th, and they're wearing their shirt sleeves. It was almost like summertime. In 2003, when I was there, we were standing on giant ice floes like this, and then we were paddling and candling ice. But this summer, not so much. It was smoky, it was hot, it was not too bad. We found great places to camp. We pulled up in this place on the Precambrian Canadian Shield, where we set up our campsite. And while we were setting up, we noticed the rain coming from a distance. We were able to check the weather report, and sure enough, it said there was a big storm coming in, rain and wind expected. So we set up our camps, secured everything as best we can, and you can see here the Tyrrell party in 1893 at a very similar looking location. But I wrote in my journal, an unrelenting wind came up overnight. Meanwhile, in 1893, the Tyrrell brothers had written, a heavy gale with cold rain set in from the north. We set up the tundra tarp for protection from the wind. We ended up spending 2 nights there. The next day, we worked our way out from Dubawnt Lake. At Outlet Bay, there was a note in Joe Lanowette's journal, which we had been reading as we went along, and we'd been noting the various sites where the Moffatt party had stayed on their 1955 trip. And he had made note of a large hill with a triangular shaped rock on top where they had erected a cairn. And so we went in search of that cairn, and sure enough, we found it. He had noted that they had wrote on lined paper. Skip had wrote a note that he put in an old Virginia tobacco can, and at the top of the hill we found that note. And here's Skip Pessel reading that note just a few months ago.
Our party of 6 men made camp at the base of this hill August 28, 1955. We have traveled by canoe from Stony Rapids, Saskatchewan, bound for Baker Lake. The weather on Dubawnt Lake has been warm, sunny, windy. Game is plentiful, and our pots are always full.
It was fascinating for us to be at a place and find the note that was left behind. The back of his note was signed by members of the first party to paddle the river since Tyrrell in 1969. That included John Lentz and George Lusty, amongst others, Dick Irwin. And they had published their copies of the notes in John Lentz's book, Tales from the Paddle. So these are all people that I knew and was in touch with, so that was pretty exciting. Similarly, there were notes from Fred Gaskin's party in 1974. I've been keeping in touch with Fred Gaskin. I sent him a note that day on my satellite communicator telling him that we had seen his note, and still right in the same place where they had left it, and hopefully this cairn will remain there and not be taken away. One of the things that Gaskin and party had done is they had gotten a letter from Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau congratulating them in 1974 as being the first party of Canadians to paddle the Dubawnt River. And this is what Trudeau said.
I am delighted to extend the warmest greetings to the first Canadian team of canoeists to retrace the original route discovered by the Tyrrell brothers in 1893. Though almost 100 years have passed since that historic journey, a sense of timelessness touches us when we re-enter the wilderness. More than any other kind of travel, a canoeing expedition strips and purifies one rapidly, inescapably. The mind is freed from its useless material baggage, from petty preoccupations. And when one returns to civilization, it is with a heightened sense of what it means to be a child of nature. One returns a more reasonable man. One returns aware of the timelessness surrounding our daily lives. May you experience.
So that is Prime Minister Trudeau. So I don't think I can go back. How do I go back? Okay, I can't go back. So at this place, we scouted a rapid just above the Dubawnt Gorge. You can see Ron and Eva out scouting. Here's what Joseph Tyrrell wrote about this rapid.
North of Dubawnt Lake, the river forms up about 200 yards wide and flows in a shallow channel down 2 light rapids. In this plain, the river rapidly deepens its channel as it rushes down in long, swift rapids, which required all the dexterity of our good canoe men to run.
So you can see there that Ron and Eric did a great job running that little rapid very carefully at the top of the Dubawnt Gorge. In my 2003 trip, we did not quite have that level of dexterity. So a couple of the guys got their canoe hung up sideways and swamped on a rock. I went out there to help them extract themselves from that situation, and Jim Gallagher had the presence of mind to grab his camera and take pictures of that. But we were very cautious of that rapid because it was right near the head of the Dubawnt Lake Gorge. And here we are at the top of that gorge. It's a 2.5-mile portage, and we set up camp at the top. And took over one load, a couple of, maybe a mile and a half over, and left some things at the base of that. I took a number of pictures with my kite aerial photography. You can see Grant Lake in the distance. It's a very long portage. And here we are talking about
This is the way we are all dressed. Bugs are horrendous. Hey, what are you saying about this portage right now, huh?
Well, it's buggy, but at least it's long.
That's a good way to put it. They say humor is a way to deal with adversity. And adversity is what we dealt with. The packs were heavy, the bugs were noticeable, the heat was oppressive. Oh, and did I mention? Every second or third step was a potential ankle breaker. So here we are in this absolutely magnificent, wonderful setting. And I'm reflecting back to what were the conditions that the first people had when they were going through here. As tough as this felt for us, it was substantially more rigorous for those who came here before us.
So here's what it looks like from the air, from kite aerial photography. You can see our canoe stashed there on the left. You can see the rapid goes quite some distance through a gorge. There's definitely places that are not paddleable, and it's certainly not with canoes anyhow. And we were able to camp kind of on this little plateau, kind of near the end. Grant Lake in the distance. Took a bath in a little lake there. Here's John checking out his tent, doing the rest tents, and it was more than flat enough for him to be able to sleep comfortably. You can see the inset there is the same picture that we've taken this past summer, a photo taken by the Tyrrell brothers. Big shout out to the Fisher Library. At the University of Toronto has an amazing collection of digital images taken by the Tyrrell brothers, along with the J.B. Tyrrell collection there. And they provided a number of these pictures. Here we are in 2003. Grant Lake was frozen to the bottom, and we were able to go have a little snowball fight on the ice as we were loading up, and paddled up Grant Lake to Canoe Point. Here we are at Grant Lake. There's a number of old Inuit archaeological sites here. This is where the Tyrrell brothers first ran into an Inuit family that they traded with and learned information about the rest of the river in 1893.
As we continued on in our journey, we made it to Canoe Point on Grant Lake. One of the last happy moments of the Moffatt party, when they cooked a large meal of caribou and their pots were full and bellies full as well. We encountered a caribou here, wandering all on its own along the shore. As we searched and searched for a campsite, we eventually found a wonderful place and a good place to swim.
And swim is what we did. So here we are. Eric is taking a swim and doing his laundry both at the same time. But we were on track with our schedule. We were doing our 14 miles a day. And so we stopped at 2 o'clock. And that was kind of something that we managed to do most days, is stop around 2 o'clock. Because we had good weather, no storms. We were on track to make our schedule. So. Here's where, in Joe Lanoette's journal from the 1955 trip, he describes, Tyrrell's meeting with the Inuit from August of 1893. So they're there almost a month later, and they still have more than 200 miles to go to get to Baker Lake. Here we are, and there's a number of rapids in this area, and here's John Sperry of our trip last summer describing the ripple rule.
The ripple rule is a simple but sometimes useful tool for following a shifting current that snakes through a rapid. The rule is that the current flows perpendicular to the ripples it kicks up. So the path of least resistance through the rapid will be perpendicular to the ripples.
So we had a lot of rapids like that. So now I'm going to get to the heart of the matter here, and this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened at what is now called the Moffatt Rapid. And so the Tyrrell party started and the Moffatt party both camped at this big quartzite hill here. And then the next day they each had paddled 1893, 1955. They passed this 15-foot fall, the 6-foot fall, and they came down here and along here. There's a set of 2 rapids that are listed here. The Tyrrell party had lunch there. They ran the first one and portaged the second rapid of that two-part drop. And then they went down here, and the Tyrrell party camped right here at the base of this rapid that's now called the Moffatt Rapid. The Moffatt party typically did fewer miles per day, and they camped, and they actually portaged around the 2 rapids by going across this little bay here. What I had done is in looking at the maps in 2003, we realized that there were a number of rapids marked on this eastern channel. And on this western channel, there's only one marked rapid. So we figured that would be much easier to run, and that's what we did in 2003. And again, this year in 2023, we did the same thing, and then we paddled upstream and around, and we camped here at the same place where the Tyrrell party had camped, and that was our plan. What we did is the Tyrrell party ran the first rapid, they portaged the second rapid, and then they camped below the third, which is where their campsite was, which they were obliged to run 1 canoe at a time. And I checked that out through the notes. This was described in his Geological Survey report. It was in the typewritten report that was typed by his sister and may have been available to the Moffatt party in 1955 in the correspondence that Tyrrell might have provided for the Moffatt party. And it was in his original handwritten field notes, which I got from the Library and Archives of Canada. And Alan Jacobs from the Wilderness Canoe Association had described this in detail. It's in his report that's published in Men's Journal online on the internet, and you can read about his theories of Tyrrell's notes and so on. But I think these notes are pretty clear that there was a third rapid that they were obliged to run 1 canoe at a time, which indicates that it was a difficult rapid, and that's where the Tyrrell party had camped, and that's where the Moffatt accident had occurred. The Tyrrell party continued up Marjorie Lake. You can see the Marjorie Hills here. His notes, were handwritten that I read and reviewed. He talked about naming Lady Marjorie Lake for the 13-year-old daughter of the Governor General of Lord Aberdeen, and they continued their path. They had snow at the end of August, ice on the banks of August, and they continued down their path towards the big lakes. The Moffatt Rapid, this is where we camped. This is what the rapid looks like from space. Fred Gaskin and his girlfriend Katie Hayhurst ran that rapid in 1974 after carefully scouting it. And here are my impressions from July 31st when I was there around 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. We spent several hours looking at this rapid and taking in the sights and sounds and imagining what it was like in 1893, imagining what it was like in 1955.
After days of blue skies, clouds came in and the smoke rolled in. It was ominous and buggy as I looked at the rapid down below, the rapid called Moffatt Rapid. The river made a slow, sweeping bend to the right. They would have seen the top and the foot of the rapids quite clearly. The current accelerates quickly, and this is where they would have seen a set of parallel lines, ledge drops. Too late to do anything but paddle and brace, and riding low in the water and not having covers, the first waves would have splashed and chilled them. The canoe turned broadside and slowly rolled over in the next set of waves, sending Art and Joe into the frigid water. The same thing happened to the second canoe just after that. Bruce and Skip were swimming, holding onto their canoe. The 4 men were clinging to the 2 canoes, washing down the rapids, surrounded by floating boxes and packs. I could see exactly how this could happen. I could imagine the shock of the cold water on a sub-freezing afternoon. and they were washed quite a long ways into the pool below. Thankfully, Peter and George stayed upright. They raced to the shore, emptied their canoe, and paddled to rescue the others. You could see the islands in the distance where the crew ended up. Art Moffatt died of hypothermia that afternoon, and the others nearly died as well.
So after the accident occurred, which was right around here, they were washed out somewhere down in here in these little islands, perhaps to this island. We thought this was the likely place, but Skip wasn't quite so sure. I should mention that around this time, I had gotten some in-reach messages that Matthew was indeed coming to Baker Lake, and he was bringing Skip Pessel with him. And later he said that he was also bringing Cree Moffatt with him. So, and they hadn't been there since the accident occurred in 1955. So this is the place where they stashed the canoe and their gear, the film, along with Art's body after the accident had occurred. They had probably been in the water for close to 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, which, it was below freezing. There's no way that could have been comfortable. It just had to be awful and really, really shocking for us to be in that spot and to realize what they had gone through. The Moffatt party, at that point, after they recovered, they said, Skip had said that the next day it was a miracle that the sun had come out, and that enabled them to live, really, because it was dry for the first time. They were able to dry and warm themselves in the sun. They wanted nothing to do with rapids, so what they did is they paddled across Marjorie Lake, and they did a 7-mile portage. And then they kind of hugged the bank of this big peninsula that sticks north into Aberdeen Lake and paddled down to Baker Lake. They did this stretch in about 8 days. They were really cruising really, really fast. We continued to follow the original Tyrrell route down to Beverly Lake, which included several other rapids. So Art Moffatt was buried in Baker Lake or laid to rest in the cemetery there. The body was recovered about 3 months after the accident had occurred, when the ice had formed and they were able to fly in with an RCMP airplane and recover the body and the film that he had been working to produce in 1955. I think it's very fitting that his grave is overlooking the land that he loved in Baker Lake. I've visited his grave site on every trip that I've gone to Baker Lake, and it's always given me pause to think about what it was like to paddle that river, to really be a pioneer and leading the first recreational canoe trip to go into that area, and the reverence that his crew had for him and the way he had instilled some values in them for the great adventure that they had to go into this land that had really been only inhabited by indigenous people before that and had really been rarely traveled up until that time. So remember I said that when I had done the trip in 2003 and again in 2023, we had taken this western channel. And while we were taking this western channel, there's this little place that's marked there by the blue diamond. You can see that rapid there. Here's another view of that rapid. I knew that rapid was there. We had it in our 1 to 50,000 maps. I'd seen it from outer space with imagery like this. We were well aware of that rapid being there, and here's what happened.
Pay attention to the canoe there in the center of the screen. It's a little bit hard to see, but that's John and Mason in front of us, and we were following them.
So this is what had occurred earlier in the day that we arrived at Moffatt Rapid that I just showed you. This was just one ledge drop. It wasn't a series of ledge drops, but it certainly got our attention and was a humbling experience. Similarly, the Tyrrell party in 1893 at the end of Marjorie Lake had a canoe accident where they destroyed or damaged a canoe that they had to repair at Canoe Casse, the Broken Canoe Rapid, which, so even experts can have these kinds of problems. And he had recorded that in his notebooks and taken photographs of the rapid where they had damaged a canoe. And so we were well aware of that. Some things that the Moffatt party missed was the Gates of Dubawnt, Tyrrell's Loudon Rapids, named for the president of the University of Toronto, and a place that we had visited in 2003. Tyrrell had published it.
Dubawnt.
A pretty tough climb, 120 feet straight up from the river to the top where we are here. You could see remnants of an old Inuit camp on the other side of the river. This year the water was low enough that we could have ran it, but we were kind of hell-bent on camping on top of that point right there. So here they are loading in 1893, they're loading the canoes after portaging and working their way around it. And then we reached the lakes. So very suddenly, big lakes, beautiful country, low land. Oftentimes canoeists get into trouble on these lakes because the winds can be strong, but we had idyllic weather. You can see, two pictures of the same Inuit cairn taken 20 years apart, and some imitating art there. And beautiful discussions here. You get a sense here of what it's like to be amongst kindred spirits where you have this experience together, and it's just a miraculous, beautiful place.
What we get from this adventure is just sheer joy, and joy is, after all, the end of life.
So we got a sense for what the Moffatt crew was following, is this sense of joy and in a beautiful place, experiencing the barren grounds for all of its beauty and majesty. And they weren't in a hurry. They weren't trying to break any records. They were trying to make a movie and to experience the North. It was just that they were there very, very late in the season, almost a month later than people would go these days into that area. But it's a place where, when you ask why do you go because of the scenery like this, and the sense of the immensity of the tundra, and the fact that you're really all alone. You might not even see airplanes. You're unlikely to see any other people, and there's few places left on the planet where you can go out for 45 days and not see others. And so there's a few other features that we had to navigate on our way down. Big rapids. Again, these were scouted carefully and then ran with great care. And I remember these from 20 years before. We had, gone through some big, big waves there. This year, the water was much, much lower, so they were not nearly as gnarly, but still took us some pause. Towards the end of the river, here's Eric paddling down. We passed a lonely muskox. We sailed down the river with the benefit of both wind and current, and literally sailed into Baker Lake. You can see Baker Lake is right around the corner here. And in 1893, the Tyrrell brothers ran into some Inuit at Baker Lake. They were there on September 2nd, and this was before the trading post was moved there. It was before the Inuit had moved off of the land. And here's what it looked like in 1955 when the Moffatt party arrived. Within an hour of their arriving in Baker Lake, 4 of the party got on the last plane of the year to leave Baker Lake, while Skip Pessel stayed behind to build a casket for his friend Arthur Moffatt. And he had hoped to go out with the RCMP to retrieve the body, but after a month, it became clear that wasn't going to happen, and that the only way for him to get out that season was to take the RCMP schooner that was going down to Chesterfield Inlet and then on to Churchill, where he could catch a plane. So he stayed for an extra month. He got to know some of the people in town at the time, consisting of about less than 50 people. When we were there in 2003, the town had grown considerably. They were getting resupplied regularly by ships. And now the town, the hamlet of Baker Lake, has over 2,000 people. So this is our trip. This is the crew. The four gentlemen who finished the trip besides Skip went on to Churchill. They flew out on September 24th. The Tyrrell party in Churchill at the end of their trip. And here's our trip as we're getting ready to go. If you've enjoyed this show, I would encourage you to consider making a contribution to support the Barren Grounds movie. One of the things that happened is the day we arrived on August 15th, Matthew Boyd showed up in Baker Lake with Skip Pessel and with Cree Moffatt and her husband Daniel. Cree is the daughter of Arthur Moffatt. She was 3 years old when Skip came to town, and so it was really fascinating to see Skip there after 68 years. It was his first time to come back to Baker Lake. You can see a trailer for the movie at Matthew's website, barrengrounds.com. There's also a place where you can make a donation if you care to support the development of this movie. He's making the movie with the original 1955 16 millimeter footage, as well as new interviews with a number of people. A lot of people went into making this presentation possible. A lot of history went into it. And I thank my fellow paddlers and advisors and people who gave input to help make this presentation possible. A lot more people are helping to contribute to the making of the movie. One of the things that we were able to do is when Skip and Matthew arrived is we were able to fly out, courtesy of Boris Kotelowitz and Helen Moffatt, to visit the site of the Moffatt Rapid again and to go to the shores of Aberdeen Lake where Skip had portaged across this 7-mile portage that they had done, and do some filming there of Skip remembering the place that he had been. So my hat goes off to Boris and Helen from Ukpik Aviation, Baker Lake Lodge. Always have been gracious hosts over all the years that I've paddled with them since the early 1990s, where they've helped provide air support for us to get out to our journeys and logistical support. And Baker Lake is a great place for canoeists to stay. Ironically, Baker Lake is now known as the mining capital of the Keewatin. The Agnico Eagle mine there employs over 2,000 people northwest of Baker Lake out in the Barren Grounds. Here's Skip, who became a geologist after his canoe trip, and Cree Moffatt reflecting on her father's life in Baker Lake. That was first reached by the Tyrrell brothers in September of 1893. Here's Matthew filming with Skip. This was just days before we left. He sent me a couple pictures of him meeting Skip for the first time when he began filming. I was still preparing my Dubawnt River maps and getting ready for the trip. When you sign on to do a movie, it's a 1 to 2 year or longer proposition. And this is not canoeists are not an audience that anybody's going to get rich off. It's going to take a lot of money to make this movie and a lot of time and dedication. I got to see Matthew in action filming the movie, and he filmed some scenes with Cree Moffatt and her husband Daniel, paying respects to Arthur, her father. He had written about her birthday in his journal, and we were there to celebrate her birthday. Here's my friend David Ford at Baker Lake at the visitor center, which was the old Hudson Bay Company post where his grandfather was one of the first traders in Baker Lake. And the home on the lower left there is the Anglican Mission church and home where he had grown up. And you can see us out there on the land at Aberdeen Lake in August, where Skip was reflecting on what it's like to be back there and what it was like for him as a young man of 22 years old 68 years ago. And Matthew learning more about Baker Lake. And he took me out to collect fish from his nets that he's been going to the same place for 40 years. He had Matthew and I over for dinner at his house where we had lake trout sushi and fried fish and baked fish. We saw the Eskimo tags from some of his friends that had lived in the community of Baker Lake since they first came off the land in the 1950s. Here he is at his store, the Jesse Unark Center, where he's the general manager. And they still make Inuit stone prints and wall hangings. And some of the ladies there that are very talented in sewing and making arts and crafts. That's an important part of the Baker Lake economy. And Matthew and Skip got a chance to meet with the mayor of Baker Lake and learn a little bit more about the history. I want to give a big shout out also to my friends, the Ford family that helped us out, and also to Sarah Silu, who I met in my 1993 trip to Baker Lake with her husband, now deceased, Oren Dury. But they have hosted many a dinner in their home. Sarah was instrumental in helping us with the logistics for making some of the filming happen this summer, and loaned us her truck to get around town. A very gracious host and a kind-hearted woman that I really appreciate for all that she's done for us. Here's Eva at the visitor center, the Akumaluk Visitor Center, named for Vera Akumaluk. And in Skip's book, he mentions that he had a traditional duffel parka made by Ikomalak. That was the spelling that he used. But Sarah helped me to figure out that that was actually Vera Akumaluk. And that's Vera, one of the elders of Baker Lake, who had made a traditional style parka for Skip, because when he got there on September 24th in 1955, it was below freezing and quite cold, and he wasn't prepared for it. So she made a parka for him. Here's the old Anglican church, and Skip remembered going to that church, and the hymns that they sang, and all of this will be in the movie that Matthew is working on using the original footage from 1955 plus new footage that he's shooting today. I think that it'll be a great testament to Arthur Moffatt and a great story of the survivors, the others who were on the trip, who after their leader died had to pull together and make this epic journey to Baker Lake on their own, and some of the challenges that they overcame and how this trip affected their lives. So there's more resources available that are available online. You can reach me on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, yahoo.com, gmail.com, my name, and there's plenty more to find out about that. But with that, I thank all of you. I think that it's been a great adventure, and I wish you well on your own journeys, wherever they may lead you.